Get ready for a deep dive into something that seems really simple at first, but gets complicated really fast.
Autonomy.
You got it, autonomy. We're going to go deep into some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, excellent.
Their entry on autonomy and moral and political philosophy.
So we're basically looking at what it means to be self-governing.
Right.
A question that has fascinated philosophers for centuries and has huge implications for how we think about, well,
Everything.
yeah, pretty much everything from our personal choices to the way society is structured.
You had me at philosophical puzzle, so let's jump right in.
Right.
The basic definition of autonomy is about governing oneself, right?
Right.
Making decisions based on reasons and motivations that are genuinely your own,
Yeah.
not just imposed from the outside, but
Yeah.
how do we even know it's truly our own
Yeah.
when we're constantly bombarded with external pressures
Right.
and internal conflicts?
Yeah, that's a really good question because our desires, values, everything that drives us is shaped by such a complex web of factors.
Mm.
Our upbringing, our culture, our experiences, it's really hard to separate those things out.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Exactly.
Okay, so if it's that tricky to even define what makes something authentically mine,
Mm-hmm.
how do we distinguish between different types of autonomy? Because it feels like there are different ways to be self-governing, right?
Yeah, absolutely there are. And one really important distinction is between moral autonomy and personal autonomy.
Okay.
So imagine a person who's facing a moral dilemma. Maybe they have the opportunity to cheat on a test or lie to get ahead.
Right.
Moral autonomy in the Kantian sense is about having the capacity to resist those temptations and act in accordance with moral principles, even if it goes against what you want in that moment.
So it's like having a really strong moral compass that guides your actions,
Right.
regardless of what you personally might want at the time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. So now contrast that with personal autonomy, which has a much broader scope. This is about making choices in any area of your life,
Okay.
from what you have for breakfast to what career you pursue.
Oh, wow.
It's about the freedom to shape your life based on your own values and goals, not just kind of external pressures.
So it's the difference between following a strict moral code versus just like charting your own course through life, through all these decisions, big and small.
Yeah, precisely. And this is where it gets even more nuanced, because how do we differentiate between autonomy and freedom?
Ooh.
They seem really similar,
Yeah.
but they're not quite the same thing.
I see where you're going with this. Just because I'm free to do something doesn't mean I'm doing it autonomously.
Exactly. Freedom is about the absence of constraints. So you're free to do something if no one is physically stopping you.
Right.
But autonomy digs deeper. It looks at the source of your actions.
Right.
Are you acting based on desires and reasons that you truly endorse as your own?
Right.
Or are you just reacting to pressures or compulsions?
Let's make this concrete.
Okay.
Let's say I can eat whatever I want.
Yeah.
I'm free to do that.
Right.
But if I'm constantly seeing advertising for unhealthy junk food and I end up making choices based on those cravings, am I really being autonomous?
That is a perfect example.
Yeah.
You have the freedom to choose, but those desires are being manipulated by outside forces. So in a way, you're less autonomous, even though technically you have the freedom to pick anything.
That's a mind-bending distinction.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if any of us are really autonomous in a lot of our choices. Like, are there different levels of autonomy?
Yeah, there absolutely are. We can think of it as a spectrum at one end. We have basic autonomy. So this is like the fundamental capacity to make choices, to have some control of your life.
Yeah.
Most adults have this basic level.
Okay.
But then we have the idea of ideal autonomy, which is kind of like the gold standard. It's where your actions perfectly align with your values and desires, free from any manipulation or coercion.
So it's like we're aiming for this ideal state of self-governance, but acknowledging that most of us probably fall somewhere in between.
Exactly.
Listener, where do you think you are on this spectrum? And do you think anyone actually achieves ideal autonomy?
That's a great question. And to be honest, philosophers have debated this for a long time. And the reality is that we are all influenced by so many factors, both internal and external, that it's incredibly challenging to be perfectly authentic.
Right.
But I do think it's a valuable goal to strive for, even if we never fully reach it. Just by being aware of the things that influence us, we can start to make more conscious and deliberate choices.
Okay, so if true autonomy is kind of this elusive goal, what are the conditions that need to be met for a person to even get close? Like, what makes someone capable of self-governance in the first place?
Well, philosophers have identified two main categories: competency conditions and authenticity conditions.
Okay.
So competency conditions are pretty straightforward. It's
Yeah.
about having the cognitive abilities needed to make rational decisions.
Okay, so things like being able to think logically, weigh different options, understand the consequences of your actions.
Yeah, exactly. It's like having the mental software needed to process information and make informed
All
decisions.
right.
Without those basic capacities, true autonomy is just impossible.
Makes sense.
Authenticity conditions, though, that's where things get a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
This is where we look at desire, motivation, and self-reflection.
Oh, boy.
Authenticity conditions are about making sure that the choices we make really reflect our values and beliefs, not just whims or external pressures.
Okay.
It's about making sure our actions are aligned with who we really are at our core.
I'm already feeling a little lost in the weeds here. How do we even begin to figure out what those authentic values and beliefs are?
Well, one really influential model comes from the philosopher Harry Frankfurt,
Okay.
and he introduced this concept of second-order desires.
Second-order desires. That sounds intense.
It's actually not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it like this. You have a first-order desire to, let's say, scroll through social media endlessly. It's just this basic urge that you have. But you might also have a second-order desire to be the kind of person who prioritizes deep focus and meaningful work over mindless distractions.
Right.
So that second-order desire is a desire about your desires. It's a reflection on what kind of person you want to be.
So it's like having a higher level desire that can override or at least try to moderate those lower level impulses.
Exactly. It's like having a mental referee
Right.
trying to keep things in check. So Frankfurt argued that for an action to be truly autonomous, you need to not only have the first-order desire that's leading you to take that action, but also a second-order desire that's endorsing that first-order desire.
Okay. So in our social media example, I might still have that urge to scroll, but if my stronger second-order desire is to focus on work, that's the one that should guide my action.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're complex beings with multiple, often conflicting desires. Autonomy is about being able to reflect on those desires and make choices that align with the desires we most deeply identify with.
Okay.
Frankfurt even uses the term wholehearted to describe this kind of identification.
Wholehearted, that's a powerful word. So it's not enough to just acknowledge I have this desire I had to truly believe that it's a reflection of who I am.
That's the idea. But of course, there are critiques of this model. Some philosophers point out that even when we think we're being wholehearted, there's always a possibility of self-deception.
Right.
We might rationalize our choices, convincing ourselves that we're acting authentically, even when we're not.
Like when you try to justify that extra slice of cake
Exactly.
by saying it's good for the soul.
Right?
So are we ever really free from those internal biases and rationalizations?
That's the question that keeps philosophers up at night, and it leads to an even deeper question. Can we ever be truly autonomous if so much of who we are is shaped by forces outside of our control, like our upbringing, our culture, the social structures we're embedded in?
This is getting seriously deep.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how even the simplest choices become tangled up in these really complex questions about what it means to be self-governing.
And we're just getting started, but I think we've laid a solid foundation for understanding the core concepts of autonomy. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these ideas play out in moral philosophy and why they're so important for our understanding of ethical behavior.
I'm already hooked. This is one of those topics that just keeps getting more fascinating the deeper you go. It's going to give you a lot to ponder. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore the moral implications of autonomy. Welcome back to our deep dive into autonomy. Last time we were kind of untangling some of the complexities of defining what it means to be self-governing. And let me tell you, my brain is still buzzing from that.
It's a concept that has a way of making you really re-examine even your most basic choices.
Totally.
And now we're going to take these ideas and see how they shape our understanding of morality.
Okay.
How does this concept of autonomy influence our sense of right and wrong, our sense of obligation and responsibility?
This is where things get really interesting for me, because we've been talking about autonomy in this very personal, individual sense.
Yeah.
But now we're connecting it to something so much bigger, like the whole realm of ethics.
Exactly.
I'm ready to see how this plays out.
Well, there's one philosopher who's basically unavoidable when you're talking about autonomy and morality, and that's Immanuel Kant.
Kant, yeah, he's kind of a big deal in philosophy. But to be honest, I've always found him a bit intimidating.
Yeah, he can be a little dense.
Can you break down his view of autonomy for us mere mortals?
I'll do my best.
No.
So, for Kant, autonomy is not just some nice-to-have quality, it's the foundation of morality.
Okay.
He argues that it's our capacity for rational self-governance that gives us moral worth.
Yeah?
It's what separates us from objects and makes us deserving of respect.
So it's not about just blindly following rules or doing what feels good.
Right.
It's about using our reason to figure out what's right, and then actually choosing to act accordingly.
Exactly. Kant sees morality as rooted in our ability to think for ourselves, to determine our own principles of action based on reason. And he even goes so far as to say that we don't get morality from external sources like God or tradition.
Okay.
Instead, it comes from within, from our own capacity to reason about right and wrong.
So it's like we're each our own moral legislators, creating our own internal laws based on what we believe is right.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But here's the key for Kant, since this moral law is based on reason and reason is universal. The moral law must also be universal.
Right.
It can't be one thing for me and something else for you. And this is where his famous categorical imperative comes in.
Yes, the categorical imperative. I've heard of that, but I'll admit it's always sounded a bit abstract and kind of
Well,
mysterious.
it's actually a pretty simple idea at its core. It's basically a test we can use to see if our actions are morally permissible.
Okay.
So the basic formulation is this act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So basically, before you act, you ask yourself, would I want everyone to act this way in the same situation?
Right.
And if the answer is no, then your action is not morally permissible.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this connects to autonomy. It's about taking responsibility for our choices and
Yeah.
making sure we're not making exceptions for ourselves. We're acting on principles that we wouldn't want everyone else to follow.
Exactly. And for Kant, this ability to universalize our principles, to step outside of our own selfish desires and see things from this broader, more objective perspective, that's the essence of what it means to be an autonomous moral agent.
So in the Kantian view, autonomy is not just about making choices. It's about making choices that are morally justifiable, that we can stand behind universally. It's a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
Do you think he's being a little too idealistic?
Yeah, that's one of the major critiques of Kant's approach. Some philosophers argue that he puts too much emphasis on reason and kind of neglects the role of emotions, intuition, and our personal experiences in shaping our moral decisions.
Right, because can a purely rational being really grasp the complexity of real-life moral dilemmas, especially when they involve things like empathy, compassion, love?
What's a great point?
Sometimes our gut feeling tells us something's wrong, even if we can't logically explain it.
Right.
And sometimes it's our emotions that motivate us to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
Exactly. Like, think about all those everyday acts of kindness and compassion,
Right.
helping a stranger, comforting a friend in need. Are those driven purely by reason, or do emotions play a crucial role?
It definitely feels like emotions are a driving force in those situations.
Yeah, right.
So does that mean Kant's whole system kind of falls apart if we acknowledge that emotions are part of the equation?
Not necessarily. Even critics of Kant recognize that reason is really important for moral decision making.
Okay.
It's just that they see a more nuanced picture where reason and emotion work together. They influence each other in these really complex ways.
So maybe Kant wasn't totally wrong, just maybe a little too focused on reason as the sole driver of morality. Okay, so even if we accept that autonomy is so crucial for ethical behavior, isn't there a risk of it becoming too individualistic? Like, what about our responsibilities to others, to our community, to society as a whole?
That's a fantastic question, and it leads to another really important dimension of autonomy in moral philosophy. The idea that autonomy is not just about individual freedom. It's also about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of other autonomous beings.
So my autonomy is only really meaningful if I respect the autonomy of others.
Exactly. It's a two-way street.
Got it.
And for Kant, respecting the autonomy of others means treating them as ends in themselves, not merely as means to our own ends.
Okay.
It means recognizing their right to make their own choices, even if we disagree with those choices.
So it's not about imposing my own moral code on others, but rather creating a space where everyone can exercise their autonomy responsibly while also recognizing the limits of that autonomy when it comes to infringing on the rights of others.
Precisely. And this idea of respecting the autonomy of others is also really deeply connected to the concept of justice. A just society is one that recognizes and protects the equal moral worth of all its members, allowing each person the space to live a life guided by their own values and principles.
This is all starting to connect in such a powerful way. Autonomy goes from being this abstract philosophical concept to something that has these really profound implications for how we interact with each other, how we structure our societies, even how we think about justice and fairness.
And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive, those broader social and political dimensions of autonomy. We're going to delve into the world of political philosophy and see how different thinkers have grappled with the challenges of balancing individual autonomy with the needs of a just and functional society.
I cannot wait to hear how this all plays out on a larger scale. Listener, we're about to leave the realm of individual morality and venture into the complex world of politics. Get ready for some serious food for thought. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into autonomy.
Quite.
We've explored this concept on a personal level. We delved into its moral significance, and now we're taking it to the macro level.
Right. The world of social and political philosophy. I'm ready to see how this idea of self-governance plays out when we start thinking about societies,
Yeah.
governments, like the whole shebang.
This is where it gets really interesting because autonomy is often seen as like the foundation of liberal political thought. It's
Yeah.
this idea that individuals have inherent rights and freedoms that should be protected from the government.
So it's like that classic sentiment, like, don't tread on me.
Exactly. The individual versus the state.
Right.
So liberalism at its core emphasizes individual choice, self-determination, limited government, and the concept of autonomy really provides this strong philosophical justification for those values.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection, but how does this actually play out in different liberal theories? Are we talking about specific philosophers or schools of thought?
One way to think about it is through the lens of social contract theory, which had a huge influence on liberal thought.
Okay.
So thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they argued that legitimate political authority comes from the consent of the governed.
So individuals voluntarily give up some of their freedom in exchange for protection of their rights and the benefits of living in a society.
So it's like a trade-off. I surrender some of my autonomy to the state, but in return, the state ensures my safety and other freedoms.
Precisely. And this idea of consent is really closely tied to the concept of autonomy, because if I'm not capable of making rational choices about how I'm governed, then my consent isn't really meaningful.
Right.
It would be like signing a contract without understanding the terms.
You can't really consent to something if you don't have the autonomy to understand what you're agreeing to.
Exactly.
So for this whole social contract thing to work, you need individuals who are actually capable of making informed, autonomous decisions.
Exactly. And that's why liberals put so much emphasis on education, freedom of speech, access to information, all those things that empower individuals to think critically and make choices for themselves. It's not just about protecting people from the state. It's about fostering the conditions that allow them to participate in shaping the state.
This is all making so much sense. But what about the critics of liberalism? Don't they have some issues with this whole autonomy thing?
Oh, absolutely. Liberalism has been challenged from many different angles, and autonomy is often right at the heart of those debates. One major critique comes from communitarians,
Okay.
and they argue that liberalism's focus on the individual ignores the importance of social relationships and shared values.
So they're saying we're not just these isolated individuals making choices in a vacuum,
Right.
that our communities, our families, our cultures, all of that plays a huge role in shaping who we are and what we believe.
Exactly. Communitarians argue that our identities, our values, even our sense of self are deeply connected to our social context. And they worry that this emphasis on individual autonomy can sometimes undermine those communal bonds, leading to a kind of atomistic individualism that erodes social cohesion.
So it's like that classic tension between individual rights and the common good. How do we balance the need for individual freedom with the needs of the community?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that political philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Another challenge to this traditional liberal view of autonomy comes from feminist thinkers who point out that this idea of the autonomous individual often reflects a very male-centric perspective.
Interesting. Tell me more about that. How does gender come into play here?
Well, traditional models of autonomy often emphasize independence, self-sufficiency, rational decision-making. But feminist scholars argue that those values don't always capture women's lived experiences,
Right.
which are often shaped by relationships of care, interdependence, and emotional connection.
So it's like assuming that everyone experiences and expresses autonomy in the same way, when in reality there might be different ways of being self-governing that are influenced by things like gender roles and social expectations.
Precisely. And this has led to the development of alternative conceptions of autonomy, like relational autonomy, which really emphasizes the importance of social relationships. In shaping our sense of self and our capacity for self-governance, it recognizes that we don't develop in isolation and that our relationships with others can both enhance and constrain our autonomy.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we've taken this seemingly simple concept of autonomy, and we've just been peeling back layer after layer of complexity, revealing all these different interpretations and challenges.
Yeah.
It feels like a never-ending journey of discovery.
It really is. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to highlight one final connection, and that's the link between autonomy and democracy.
Okay.
So, in a democratic society, citizens are expected to participate in making decisions that affect their lives, right?
Right.
But for that participation to be meaningful, those citizens need to be capable of making informed, independent choices.
So a healthy democracy actually depends on having citizens who are capable of exercising autonomy. It's like a fundamental prerequisite for the whole system to work.
Exactly. That's why things like education, access to information, freedom of speech, and a vibrant public sphere where different ideas can be debated, those are all so crucial for a thriving democratic society. They're not just nice to haves, they're the very conditions that make genuine self governance possible.
This has been such an incredible journey. We started with this seemingly simple idea of autonomy, and we've explored its implications in our personal lives in the realm of morality, and now in the context of social and political structures. It's amazing to see how this one concept can touch so many different aspects of human existence.
It really highlights how fundamental autonomy is to how we understand ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we organize our societies. And even though there's no easy answer to what it means to be truly autonomous, I think the very act of grappling with these questions, of reflecting on the forces that shape our choices, is incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. It's like you've given our listeners a mental workout, flexing those philosophical muscles and challenging them to think critically about what it means to be self-governing in a world that's constantly trying to influence our thoughts, our desires, our actions.
And hopefully, we've equipped them with some new tools and perspectives to navigate that complexity and to continue exploring these questions long after our deep dive is over.
Well said, listener. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the fascinating and multifaceted world of autonomy. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep striving for a world where individual self-governance is both valued and protected. Until next time, keep diving deep.